Diana, thank you so much for the intro, and I'm so blessed to be here with you, Alap, and with this community.
So great to have you. So excited to chat.
I think I told Johnny it's like my wedding day because hear me out. On weddings, you have like your partner's family and then your own family meet, probably for the first time in most families. Awkward. And here, my world gets to merge because I used to think about my work and then about my friendship as two separate things. And friendships were this indulgence. I would see friends at night or in the weekend. And as I've grown into the woman that I am, I really want to see my life as an harmonious one line, one merge, where my friends get to see me at work and when I get to see my work with my friends, if that makes sense. So it's a pleasure to be here.
I'm glad you brought that up to start. I think that's certainly Johnny and I's motto in terms of the way we operate. But there is certainly like this, especially as a startup founder, under so much pressure to sort of deliver. There's like I'm going to put the rest of my life on hold and spend all of my time here. And once you have a little bit of time and perspective, you find it's just so counterproductive because like you can't work more productively more than a certain number of hours a day, and you as a human just need that holistic like experience, including friends. It's so important.
Yeah, we raised a bunch of series, and when we raised our A round, that was about 3 years ago. I literally felt my heart like signing a contract with money. And I assumed that because I had raised money, that I now need to show up for that money. And every time I didn't grow the money would be mad at me. And that's just a metaphor for the way VC-backed founders act. And then you think to yourself, when you start a company, you're like, it's going to be 3 years, and then I'm going to sell it, and it's going to be okay. And that doesn't happen to most of us. And I actually never thought about the end goal when I started. So yeah, it's a marathon. And I think founder life is being glamorized for sure. We're not warriors. We're just people who chose not to be working at a regular job and to be our own bosses. But it comes with a price. And the less you glorify it and the more you talk about it, the better it is.
So on that note, would love to start out by understanding kind of your founding story, how you got into this, and just tell us more.
I started my company. I co-founded Tulu. I co-founded Tula when I was about 25. I was a waitress. I was doing my master's degree in environmental science, and I didn't really know what I was going to do for work. I was studying for an exam in the library, and guess what I was doing? I was on Facebook. Back then, it was a cool social app to be on. And I was like scrolling Facebook, anything just not to study. And I saw this ad for a fellowship at MIT. And I even remember reading the ad and being angry. I was like, oh, it's a free fellowship at MIT for exceptional leaders. And I was like, I hate those people already. I'm not one of those people who get accepted to this type of programs. So I applied. And I filmed this video. Back then, I wasn't really doing much for work. I was an intern. I was doing different projects, but I didn't know it was called being an entrepreneur. I just thought I was doing projects and I had ideas. But I filmed a video about this one project that I was working on with hydroponic farming. And that got me into the program. I met my co-founder there. I moved to Boston for a semester. I met my co-founder, who's an architect. And we had a panel, and it was a week into the fellowship. There was a panel, and there was like 6 experts from MIT, and they were talking about 2030. And they were talking about the future city and how cool that city will be, and it will have really clean sewage, and there will be like this like pink sky, like all the renderings, and there will be robots among us. And then I raised my hand and I said, what does my generation of entrepreneurs need to build today to actually get us there? Because it seems like all we do is talk, and those conferences are great, but like, what do we actually need to build? And my co-founder came up to me after the conversation, after I raised my hand, and he told me about his passion for the built environment. So the built environment is essentially this place, buildings, and we both wanted to work together. And that's how Tulu was, the seeds were born.
That's amazing. And tell us about your MVP and how you got started.
So since when I was 23, I lived in an apartment the size of a shoebox. It was literally like Harry Potter's room times 2. And New York is my fourth city where I lived in very small apartments. Now my apartment is a bit bigger, but every time I would move an apartment, and you all must know this, like every time I would move an apartment, I would tell myself, I gotta own less things. Like moving is such a hassle. It's so expensive. And then like you look at all your crap, you're like, why did I have to buy this candle at TJ Maxx? And shout out TJ Maxx. And yeah, I became a minimalist throughout my 20s, and I figured that you can get rid of stuff, but you still need function, and you still need to make your food and clean your apartment. And I would look at buildings, and it would just not make sense that the way we live in today is so inefficient. And so I came with this alternative consumption paradigm shift, and my co-founder, who's an architect, had all these ideas about buildings as form follows function and different innovative ideas to do in buildings. And we had just spent a very intense summer in Boston, and we were literally trying to come up with ideas. And Tulu was one of the ideas that came up to us, but it wasn't the idea we executed right away. It felt like this, like someone else must have done this. It's too simple and yada, yada, yada. And yeah, when we tried other ideas, that idea just kept being in the side of our mind. And we said, what if we try this one for a bit? And we got a grant. We got a $50K grant from MIT and OGS, which is a fellowship we were a part of, and burnt the majority of money on that other idea, had 10 grand left. And we tried this. We went on Facebook Marketplace. Actually, it's the Israeli Craigslist. You will not know it, but it's a very sketchy place. And we bought like a Dyson vacuum cleaner V10, and we got a few other products. And we had one of our friends had a building, and she talked to her landlord, and he said, yeah, these guys can do something in their basement. So I talked, and I haven't even told you what we do yet. So how many of you know Tulu? Okay. I see her. Nice. So essentially, Tulu, and I'll go back to our MVP story in a second. Essentially, Tulu is this gorgeous platform that sits in your lobby or your amenity floor, and you can rent items for as long as you want with an app. You can rent items like a projector, a vacuum cleaner, a scooter. You can use a printer. You can even buy snacks, and it's all in the convenience of your building. And to run our MVP, we said, what if we choose one building and we let the neighbors know that it's now active? We built this really lousy prototype on Wix, and we just wanted to see if people use it. I've never done marketing in my life before. I didn't even know how to send a few emails like at once. So I went door by door and told people, hey, there's a pizza party this Friday. Come check it out. There's a new service in your basement. We ended up having a few neighbors show up, and we had our first funnel. And with that funnel, we were able to expand to another building. And that's how we started thinking about the business.
That's great. And I think one thing that's really unique about your business model versus most others is that it's B2B, but it's also B2C. So would love to just help the audience understand kind of that unique aspect and like how it kind of really supercharges your business.
Yeah, I thought a lot about what you said about the economy and the macroeconomy, and how during COVID, when there were all the shipping issues, we still had PlayStations because we rent out gaming consoles and we rent out different entertainment items, and people couldn't get those items because they had to wait like 3 weeks or a month, and they could then use Tulu. So in terms of the way that you make access happen, that was a really a big benefit for us. Could you remind me the question again? It's like I heard, B2B2C. Thank you. So B2B2 sense for Tulu is we work with landlords so we can get to the residents. So in that way, buildings are not who we are, it's our go-to market. So we have two sectors in Tulu. We have the team that sells to landlords. That's our goal, to expand in buildings. We work with mainly student housing and residential and luxury residential buildings. And then we try to get to the end user and get them to use our products. So that makes our CAC lower, our customer acquisition lower. That makes the engagement better because when we enter a building, we know to segment it. We know if it's young professionals, we know if it's students, we know if it's elderly people. Like we just launched a building in Miami. Sorry, not in Miami, in Naples, in Florida.
Not Miami at all.
I'm foreign. Florida is one. And
I'm not going to respond to that. It's a Floridian.
Can we erase it? But yeah, so essentially, it really helped us scale faster because we knew what buildings we wanted to get to, and we knew how to crack product market fit with landlords. We just had to sell it to enough landlords, and with users, we just have to get enough people per building to use Tulu.
And what about the fourth element of the B, which is the sponsors? The brands, rather.
Yeah. So when we built our first pitch deck, we had a logo of a big brand. And a lot of investors told us, prove your business first. But from day one, we knew how we were going to eventually get brands involved. And this is actually a good segue to AI because that's how we got started with our brands. So now we are operating in 350 buildings worldwide. A lot of these buildings have small apartments and young professionals who are living in them. So essentially, it's a very, very high quality demographics who are using items. And we knew from day one that it wasn't enough just to put a few items in an amenity floor and hope people will use it. So we hired what any startup would do, a UX researcher. And we asked her to conduct studies and kind of get us to understand what makes people use, what makes them use more, what don't they like. And about 3 months into her working with us, she came from a big corporation. She told us, this is a really fascinating company and I'm learning so much, but there's no one single thread. There's so much segmentation and different case studies. And if you want to find what makes people use more, you just got to hire 10 more of me. And we told her, listen, you're already very expensive for us because you're from a corporate, and we can't do that. But while we were doing that, we started working with a few AI tools, and one of those tools enabled us to survey users in what in the past would have been much harder. So right now, if you're a Tulu user, you can actually opt in to film a video while you're using the item or after you're using the item and converse with an AI app that asks you question. And that would have been something we would have done a long time ago. In the past few years, we started working with Bosch and a few other brands, and they would give us products highly subsidized or for free to give to our residents because it's a great exposure and there's so many other benefits. And essentially, we started talking to them about all these learnings we have with what we call the Tulu brain. So the Tulu brain is this AI consumer insight that we're using in-house. And they started asking us, hey, what if we use that? What if you start asking your users questions about our vacuum and if they prefer this vacuum over a different vacuum? And we started selling it as insights.
And would you have been able to do this a few years ago? Like, what was different about the infrastructure and AI that really enabled that?
I think generally what I'm seeing for startups with AI, it's we use it for hyper personalization. And we were not for sure able to do it last year at all. These are things that if we were to build in-house would take us much longer. And I think the last 2 years have changed so much, the tech game. However, it's how you use tech. So today, Amazon has a personalized page for every single one of us. And that's been going on for like the last 7 years or even longer. Today, tech companies like us that are, fairly young, we can get to the same quality of personalization with on-the-shelf platforms that we're embedding in our app. So in that sense, we can compete faster. But for us, what really changed the game was to integrate a few of these tools and make them our own. And then eventually it's a product that we now work with.
It's so profound how much companies can accelerate themselves, especially startups with AI today. The things that might take a team, a single person can do now. And the really, really powerful thing about that is, as a startup, your main secret weapon versus larger incumbents is speed and the ability to just move really fast and find niches. And AI, like this example, clearly accelerates that so much. But the other part of it is the thing that gets really tricky when you're scaling a startup is when you're like 5 people sitting at a table, right? There's no real coordination problem. Everybody on the team knows exactly what needs to get done. But when that 5 goes to 20, it gets much, much more complex. And when 20 goes to 100, it gets that much more complex. But now we're seeing so many examples today of, that team that would have went from 5 to 20 is going from 5 to 7 or 5 to 10. And they're getting so much more acceleration out of those incremental people because AI is just letting them cover so much more ground. So obviously not news to anyone, but it's just like, I think the beginning of what is going to end up being such a large trend. And so many companies now that are going to get scaled with just like very, very few humans, which is like, there's pros and cons to that. But certainly from like an investability perspective and like getting to profitability sooner, it really makes a huge difference. The other thing that I wanted to sort of highlight, which is really fascinating about your model, I think this might be the first company I've seen that is like B to B to B to C. And that really sort of supercharges your business, right? As an investor, just thinking about, okay, instead of, because ultimately, who is paying the bills? The customer who is renting your products for a day, for a week, is the one that's, swiping their credit card, and that's where most of your revenue is coming from, right?
So the most of our revenue is actually from landlords.
Okay,
Yeah.
even more interesting, right? So it's a combination of landlords and customers, but because you get those landlords, they bring you the customers essentially for free. And then same thing, once you got to a certain level of scale, the brands want to work with you and they're giving you a bunch of their products for free. So it's a really interesting example of, just coordination of all these different players in a space. And once you get to a certain scale, how so many additional doors open up. But again, you have to start with like, one little apartment, the first customers, and then it's just like a sort of a beautiful ramp from there.
Yeah, it's an ecosystem. Essentially, it's an ecosystem between, at the beginning, we had thought we needed to get to much bigger scale to start attracting brands. And that happened only in our 40th building. Now we're at 350 and we're going to get to 500 very soon. We're launching a building almost every day now. And we wanted to create a compelling enough argument for every side of the equation. Essentially, landlords are finding Tulu as a great amenity to attract residents. I think COVID really proved that, the people who stayed in New York and who stayed in big cities and didn't leave needed more from their building. And then this is actually a little bit of a segue to a greater shift that's happening to our generation. A bunch of us here are probably single, right? When women are now marrying in their late 20s, on average in the US, and that means we're renting apartments for longer, which means we're living in smaller apartments, which means we do less upfront payments. So we're looking for a fractional ownership solution. 3 out of 5 Americans say that they're preferring to rent things. And we're already seeing the subscription model adopting in all softwares. And we're seeing it now in fashion. But the built environment, hardware, and other appliances are just now starting to develop this Netflixization model. I'll get to how to say it. But because our generation is so different than the previous generation, we're the most mobile generation in the world. We're moving apartments so often. By the time we're 40, we would have moved 12 times. So the average American, by the time they're 40, they would move 12 times. And that's a staggering numbers. We move apartments, we move countries, we move from one relationship to the other, and that changes. Bless you. That changes what we own. And I think ownership has become this thing that is a hassle, and we want to be more mobile. So services like Tulu are really trying to speak and tailor their need for a generation.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So you mentioned COVID. That seems like a really interesting challenge for a business like yours. Would love to understand what went down and kind of how you reacted.
COVID was so challenging in so many ways and so rewarding in so many ways. And of course, we're privileged. We got to live in New York, and we had already raised some money. So we were able to extend our runway until we got more clarity about what was going to happen. But essentially, I moved to New York at the end of 2019 to scale a business in New York. And then we launched maybe 4 or 5 buildings and got a office building in Times Square, which we thought was so cool. And I even remember we moved to Times Square and I did the slow motion round. No one told me that Times Square is not the right place to hang. So we had an office in Times Square during COVID, and we launched a few buildings, and then COVID started, and we were gonna launch 100 buildings in 2020. So we didn't do that. We launched a lot less. But the buildings that did bring us in, we saw 2 different trends. We saw half of the building usually was not even living in the building, but the people who did stay in the building, we were able to really use them to crack the consumer, to crack our upsell, to crack our relationship building, to crack our community, and to keep iterating on our offering. Someone asked me, how do we know what items to put in a Tula unit? We would send these surveys to people, and people would vote for like a pasta maker or a bread maker, which was a very COVID thing. People thought they were going to bake. Some people did bake. But what we saw in those surveys, that there's such a big difference between what your preferred choices and your revealed choices. So a lot of people say that they want to do something, but in reality, they don't. So now we have our best sellers, but COVID really did make our usage better, but it also made our scaling to buildings different. We would talk to landlords. A lot of landlords wouldn't even take calls with us. They're like, are you seriously telling me you're trying to sell me an amenity that makes neighbors go downstairs and share a vacuum, share an air fryer when it's a pandemic? So we had to change fast. But one of the coolest thing that happened during COVID was maybe a year into, having our business in New York, we got this mysterious email from a guy named Peter in Amsterdam. And he said, hey guys, I read an article about you. I really love your business. I think you could be huge here in the Netherlands. I would like to bring you here. So we ignored it. And
Of course.
we're like, and after a few weeks, we're like, hi, Peter. Thank you so much for writing to us. Yes, bring us to the Netherlands. Let us know when you have a contract. We'll pay you. My earring fell. And Peter reached out a few weeks later and he's like, guys, I have a deal. It's with Greystar, which is the largest residential owner in the world.
Wow, that never happens to startups.
Yes,
that's amazing.
Never. And we didn't have a strategy yet on how to scale in Europe. And we told them we can be there within a month. Let that sink in. I said, yes, clearly. So then we read online that no one can enter the Netherlands. It was October 2020. No one, unless they have a special permission if they're not Dutch. So we really had to kind of pivot and say, okay, like what if we launch Tulu in the Netherlands without having to go there? What if we find a carpenter that can maybe produce the units? And what if we work with a remote operator? And we did it. And it took us a little bit longer than a month, but we launched Tulu in the Netherlands. And we took a leap of faith. We showed Greystar that we were serious. And after that, we launched with Greystar 10 more buildings in London. So that choice of going kind of against the natural path of scaling in New York because of the pandemic led us to a different market. And a lot of our investors were actually quite against it. Defocus has been our kind of strategy for that stage of the company. We're like, let's just see, it's a pandemic. We need to make money and we need to scale. And in hindsight, that was a good decision for us.
That's great. It's fascinating. And then obviously, you've raised a lot of capital over a few rounds. I think your most recent round was in 2022, which was a really interesting time, kind of close to the peak of the market. And obviously things have changed pretty substantially down and then back up since then. Would love to understand learnings from that process, how you adjusted to different market environments, and also just broadly any advice for some of the other founders or potential founders in the room when it comes to fundraising.
So I'm very lucky. I have an incredible co-founder who's going to come here later. I told him that to not come when I talk. But fundraising is, of course, a challenge for every single founder, unless they're in AI these days. And I'm sure it's then a challenge too. We have hardware, we have CapEx, we have OpEx, but we know our numbers. So raising money with the wrong investors has been a challenge. Conversations would usually divert to a unit economic, very particular discussion about finance. And luckily, into the process, we learned to say, no, this is not the conversation we're going to have with you, Mr. or Mrs. Investor. We're going to talk about the vision. And that was really helpful at the A round and the seed round, because we were able to kind of talk about the consumer change, about how we're going to grow. For us to become a $100 million company, we only need to service 3.5% of the serviceable market. And that's without Asia and Australia and other markets and hotels and offices, which we're not active in yet. So I think, when you're talking to the wrong investor about a big problem that they're not passionate about, you're just going to have a pretty boring conversation. So we learned on how to talk to the right partners, and we learned also other ways to finance our business. We now have a few different solutions. But I guess you really need to find the right partner that can, dream big with you.
Makes sense. And then how did you change sort of your approach after raising your A round when the markets really changed?
I remember after we raised our A round, we had our team do an exercise about how each department needs to grow. And, we had all assumed we were going to all hire 10 more people for each department. And we realized that capital is now different going into 2023, going into 2024, and that it needs to be spent on a wiser approach. And how can we do more with less? That has usually been our approach. Also, from an org chart perspective, I think when we started the company, it was very obvious that we had to be really resilient as founders, and then the employees can kind of be along for the ride. And that's not our approach anymore. Every person that works for Tulu needs to be resilient on their own. We're looking for people who don't burn out from changes. They don't burn out from pivots. It's part of the business. It's part of who we are. So we really learned on how to hire correctly. After our A round, we also really thought we needed to bring people with, huge experiences from companies like Uber and Airbnb and different companies. And then you really get to see how people react and work when push comes to shove. And now we're hiring people based on their intention and based on how inspired they are and how much work they're able to do with, their natural gifts.
What makes you unique as a leader and a founder and a boss?
Thank you, Adam. To be clear, I did not ask him to ask this question. When I started Tulu, I had such low confidence because I came, I'm much younger than my co-founder. And I was like, okay, all I have is my hard work, my work ethic, and all I have is my intent to learn and to learn fast and to grow with the company. And nothing's going to stop me. And then a few years go by and no, that's not all you have. And I'm trying, and I hope this can resonate with people. It's you have you. And so we're all unique in that sense. But I feel like it's really important to not hide who I am from my team. And I feel like the team we have now, and Sophia and Julia are here somewhere from my team. And so I did this thing. I would wear t-shirts and sneakers, and I wanted to look like Elon Musk. How can I look like Mark Zuckerberg today? And because I wanted to be taken seriously, because I thought that if you look like Mark Zuckerberg and if I look like a guy, I would be taken seriously. And then I realized that I have to embrace who I am, and I have to embrace my quirkiness, and I can run the business. So I've got my Enneagram, and I'm a big believer of Enneagram because I now know who I am and how I can kind of match my business approach to who I am. And other people in the company can do things that match them better. So I think as a leader, you really have to do the work on yourself. If you are triggered by a comment someone makes and you get triggered in a conversation with everyone else in the room, you need to do more work on yourself, because you got to show up to work and grow with your team, reflect to your team and be authentic, but also keep iterating on who you are to show up more wholesome, so it doesn't take away from what you're trying to do, which is to build big things.
Hello. Hi. Thank you again. Pardon the kind of critical question, but you offered a point of that there's a liberation of a lack of ownership that goes along with the sharing economy that you're helping to enhance here. So do you see that as something because it's so difficult to own? And how do you see the difficulty in ownership correlate with your business?
So have you heard about the term the solo economy? A lot of people, I think it's 1 out of 4 people, are now living alone. And in cities like Stockholm, over 50% of adults are living alone. So when we live alone, we need to own alone. And we need to own a microwave and a refrigerator and a sofa and a vacuum and all that. And I think the alone economy and the prices overall in living in a city, as young professionals, we want to live where things are happening and we want to get a good job. So ownership, it doesn't free you, but it saves you money. And that's where fractional economy, essentially like when you're renting things, you're sort of leasing them very, very fractionally. So I don't think it sets you free for me personally, yeah, it sets me free. It sets me free being able to move around the world with 2 suitcases. For people that live in the suburbs and they like having their own products, maybe that's actually a source of comfort. So I can't speak to that, but I think for our generation, who's more mobile, who's going to move more, I think owning less things and being able to use services that allow you access and that are just as good as ownership, I think it's a good solution for the time we're at.
It's a correlation of home ownership and the use of fractional economy services, and that essentially that, yes, we can certainly discuss it being liberating, being able to move around the world and live in 20 different places across your 40 years. But how much of that is just a reaction to how difficult it is to own things than kind of serving a market that wants to share rather than just can't own?
Yeah, I mean, you can make the same argument about Uber, why not owning a car? Is that a freedom, or is that parking is very expensive and there's traffic and there's all that? So I think all these models that are offering subscription, so we're sort of fighting the buying economy. A buying economy is an economy in you buy something and then it's like a make, take, break model. It's very not sustainable in many cases. And now we're doing a model where it's one to many. So, but on the individual front, I do think it's a response. It's a societal response. It's like a bigger movement against a traditional economy that's not supporting our generation. We're not doing it from like a social place. We're doing it from more of like a practical place. But I think your question holds a very interesting dynamic.
So it's a great question, and it's a very vexing issue that I think most of the West is facing right now, but especially the US more than anywhere else, where and I think this relates to the conversation we were having at the beginning, where, China has run so far ahead of us because part of it is, it's an autocratic country and you can decide, this land is now going to be used for a factory. But part of it is also, we've really hamstrung ourselves in the United States and we can't build anymore. I think, Ezra Klein's new book on abundance really goes to this in great detail. It's a great read, quick read for folks if you're interested. But essentially what happened is, we were really aggressive in polluting and a lot of other problems around sort of, folks like Bob Moses and others like riding roughshod over like minority communities and poor communities. And in the 60s and 70s, in response to that, we passed all these environmental laws and we pushed kind of all the decision making for building to the grassroots, and in the process made it really easy for just one person or a few people to gum up the works of like how public things are built, like be it a school, be it a community center, be it homes, and in the process it's very, very easy to block building, and I think that's gotten worse and worse and worse. And I think in a lot of the most affluent and sort of the most desirable cities in the US, you add on top of that if you're an existing homeowner, I lived in San Francisco for many years, right? If you're an existing homeowner, there's a huge incentive to not let people build because the value of your property is going to go up. And so I think all of those things have really come to a head right now. And in the process, there's just no affordability. We don't build nearly enough housing. I think housing is the single biggest problem in this country. And if you actually fixed housing, pretty much every other downstream problem would have a huge impact. And so, I think the one thing that is a little heartening is that, both sides of the aisle seem to be waking up to this today. The pitch before the trade war started is like, we're going to bring supply chains home and we're going to make it easier to actually build the factories, build the homes to house the employees and everything else to actually make that work. We've seen the pain. We haven't seen the other side of it in terms of deregulation. I'm a little skeptical we're going to be able to pull it off, but it's imperative that we do both sides of it for it to actually work. But it's sort of an insane kind of coordination tragedy that we have in this country that we've gotten this far from kind of where we used to be. And for the first time, it seems like everyone's really paying attention. And so hopefully we're going to make some progress.